Welcome everyone to a Whiskey Journey presented by the MIT Club of Boston. It is my pleasure to welcome you tonight. My name is Kevin McCumber. I run food and beverage events for MIT alumni. And I'd like to thank the MIT Club of Boston for continuing to support these events, as well as the MIT Alumni Association and clubs of Boston and clubs of MIT across the country for helping us get the word out about these events. I also want to thank Taylor & Taylor Whiskey Company, as well as Beam Suntory, for donating the samples that many of you are going to be trying with us tonight, if you are able to get one of the tasting kits. I also really like to thank Taylor & Taylor for putting a lot of work into assembling and distributing the kits. It's really important that we have those kits for these events, and I really appreciate the effort that they put in to make that happen. Finally, I'd like to thank all of you, fellow alumni and friends, for continuing to join these events, for putting up with me as your event host, for being very generous with your donations toward MIT's COVID-19 response funds. A lot of you have joined numerous events and you keep hearing me harp on making these donations. I appreciate your putting up with me and for continually being generous and joining me in supporting those funds. All right, let's kick it off. I'm going to do a very brief introduction like usual. Then I'll turn it over to Nick Taylor from Taylor & Taylor Whiskey Company, who will be doing the presentation for this evening and doing the tasting and the Q&A session. And then we'll conclude the event with breakouts, which are just little social rooms where we get in groups of 4 to 6 people randomly assigned and just chat about what you're tasting, your roots at MIT, where you are, really anything you want to talk about. And no good tasting is complete without an after party. So after the breakouts, we'll be coming back together. Everyone will be able to unmute and we can have a good chat with Nick, very informal, very casual about anything that's on the top of our minds. Yes, this event is being recorded, and that recording will be made available on the MIT Club of Boston's YouTube channel. I'll be sending the link for this recording after the event early next week. So watch out for that email. And as you know, this event is free to attend, and I ask that you please join me in contributing to MIT's COVID-19 response funds to fight the many, many negative effects of the pandemic. If you'd like to ask a question tonight, we have a portal that you can ask them through. As I'm sure you can understand, with 100+ people joining, it gets a little bit unmanageable if all the questions are in the Zoom chat. So I know sometimes it's a little challenging to go to a website, especially if you're on mobile, but we ask just for the sake of the process to please try to use that portal. So go to meet.ps/MIT Whiskey. You can submit your question there and see questions that other people have asked. You can upvote those questions, and then Nick and I will just pick questions from the top of that list and get to as many as we can over the course of the evening. If we don't get to your question, my apologies, but I will be providing Nick's email in that post-event email that will go out to you next week. So you'll be able to follow up with Nick if you'd like. This event is one in an ongoing series of food and drink events that we put on. There's a lot of events coming up, and there's still more being added to the calendar after that. There will be a survey sent out in the post-event email. I ask that you please complete the survey because we do get a lot of our event ideas from the feedback on that survey. We also have some ways to stay in touch. I suggest that you join my email list, and I'll send out the link for that. That makes sure that you hear about all the food and beverage events that we organize. And we also have the MIT Alumni Fine Spirits Society group on Facebook, where we publicize events and also have just a little bit of casual conversation in between events about fine spirits and everything else that's kind of goes along with it in this series of events. All right, now it is my pleasure to introduce Nick Taylor, co-founder of Taylor & Taylor Whiskey Company and co-founder of the new whiskey brand, Found North Whisky. Nick and his much wiser and better looking brother, Zach, are friends of the MIT Club of Boston. They've been leading events with us since I think 2015 when I first met Nick as he was working retail out here in the Boston area. They've since gone on to great things, launching the Domaine de Chiron brand of Armagnac and now Found North Whisky. Really a pleasure to have Nick with us tonight. Nick, I'm going to turn it over to you. Take it away And thank you again for joining and for all that you've done for the MIT Alumni Group.
Kevin, thank you so much for having me and that cruel introduction. But no,
I couldn't
honestly,
do it.
I know. I can't tell you how excited I am to be here, guys. For like so many reasons. One, the MIT group is and has been perpetually one of my absolute favorite groups to present for. I think you guys are awesome. When we were doing these in person, just the conversation and the level, the depth of questions that I get, it really is really exciting for me. If I didn't love talking about this, it would be a crappy job. So I'm really, really delighted whenever I get a really interested group, and it's not really surprising given that you guys have such a great institution. Really, it's not a surprise that I get such great questions. That being said, there are a couple other reasons why I'm super excited. First and foremost, if you guys have seen me present before, you're usually tasting whiskeys or other spirits that I'm representing as a brand ambassador, or that I'm importing even, which is super fun. And I had a wonderful time doing that. I always did. This is the first time you'll have seen me presenting as a whiskey maker, which is just a totally bizarre thing to say. But we'll talk about Found North in a little bit. But the other reason I'm so jacked up about tonight's presentation is I fancy myself a whiskey historian. I have tried for about 10 years to really get at the crux of all of the different things that go into that factor into why the whiskey we taste today tastes the way it does and why we drink what we drink. And I love the cultural, historical, and economic reasons behind it. And it's amazing how little events in history and time and just things and how integrated they are with the whiskey, with the world of whiskey. And I guess for me, I feel a little bit like I'm a piece of it now, because we're doing something really exciting with Found North in terms of trying to bridge the gap a little bit of American whiskey, as in, American whiskey from the U.S. and Canadian whiskey, and really starting to think more about it as North American whiskey. And really, I get to tell you guys a story that nobody's telling, and nobody's really talking about. And I do think you guys will find it pretty fascinating if you like whiskey, which I assume you guys do because you're here. So let's dive right in. Canada has this just gigantic whiskey industry. It's so close to us, and for centuries it has been just intricately linked with how we make, sell, and consume whiskey in the United States. And basically from when whiskey started being made here on this continent until really the 1960s, the two industries were like this. And then the U.S. basically did everything it could. And I should say the whiskey industry within the U.S. did everything it could to sever that connection in the 1960s, and they did it very successfully. And that's basically where we've been for the last 50 years, until WhistlePig. And WhistlePig, which a lot of you have probably heard of. Some of you may, if you're out of state, maybe drinking WhistlePig instead of RRI tonight, which I apologize for, will be available in other states soon. But WhistlePig has had an enormous impact on the whiskey industry in a really kind of indirect and unintended way, which is always the fun thing about whiskey. So there's just so much in here. So let's just really dive in. When we look back historically at whiskey makers in North America, we always think Irish and Scottish, right? It's like the Irish influence, the Scottish influence. These people who were emigrating from those countries to the United States, they brought whiskey here, right? But the biggest influence on North American whiskey was actually the Germans. In fact, the most important whiskey making family of all time is German, period. And that always catches people off guard. They're like, what? Like, there's not like this big, robust whiskey making culture in Germany. how is it that the Germans had such a huge impact? But there's a giant George Lucas-esque hint lying in plain sight. In 1795, having recently moved to Kentucky from Pennsylvania, a man named Johannes Bohm, a farmer and first-generation immigrant from Germany, sold his first barrel of whiskey. This family was part of the really big German-Swiss migration to the United States in the 18th century. And the migration actually included the Overhault family. They were in this same wave. And the Johannes's family did two things in abundance. One, they procreated a lot. He had like 12 kids, and they all had 12 kids. It's wild when you look at the family tree. It's like, whoa, that's a wide family tree. And then the other thing they did in abundance was make whiskey. No son was more famous at it than Johannes's son James. Anybody got it yet? To make their whiskeys more appealing to Americans, they anglicized and actually Americanized their name to Beam, right? James Beam, Jim Beam. So no family has had a more prominent role in shaping the North American whiskey industry. And if you look at every major distillery and brand starting in the early 1800s, there's like a very, very high probability that a Beam family member was involved, and probably like heavily involved. They either ran it, built it, or at the very least worked there. Jim Beam, obviously, but Heaven Hill, the biggest distillery in the U.S., the Parker's Heritage Collection, right? Their most famous collection. It's named after Parker Beam. You look at Stitzel Weller, right? Stitzel Weller was actually the one of the early distillers was a Beam, right? They in case anybody is unfamiliar with Stitzel Weller, that's Pappy Van Winkle. The Michter's, Maker's Mark, you keep going on and on and on, and you'll just always find a Beam. Descendants of Johannes Beam have been the head distiller or the master distiller of 30 different distilleries in the US and Canada, and they've created 40 different brands, and now the Jim Beam Company owns so many other brands. But what impacted the fact that they were German, and what impact did Germans actually have on how whiskey is made, right? And what they were really responsible for was introducing the importance of rye as the spicy warming component of whiskey. And the main reason was because they loved using rye as the base spirit of schnapps, which actually brings us to our first whiskey. The first whiskey we're going to drink tonight is the Old Overhault. So go ahead and pour yourself Old Overhault. Old Overhault is a rye whiskey. To be clear, to be a rye whiskey from the United States, it has to be made from a mash bill of at least 51% corn. It must be aged in new charred oak containers, aged at least 2 years, bottled at no less than 40%. And honestly, there are like 15 more rules. There are a lot of rules when it comes to American whiskey. So real quick, guys, I'm gonna share my screen in a second so you can see my Old Overhault notes. But really cool old brand. And this is the sort of the signature we call it like a well rye for every bar for making Manhattans. I guarantee Old Overhault has been used in more Manhattans than any whiskey ever. This is like the signature whiskey for bars. And there's a bunch of reasons why. You're about to taste why. That's going to be one of them. And another is it's very competitive from a price standpoint. So real quick on how to taste. I'm going to pour right here into a Glencairn glass. If you don't have a Glencairn glass, that's fine. No worries. The couple things. I trust nobody's going to shoot this, but a couple things other than that. When you nose it, I would nose with my mouth open. I can see some people already going from nostril to nostril. I actually do recommend that. You can go up and down. Some people do that. I don't know. That one seems a little weird to me. The separate nostril thing has always made a lot of sense. I wouldn't bury my nose in it. I definitely would keep my mouth open when you're nosing it. This is only 43% alcohol by volume, so it's not gonna kick you in the teeth. But I know Kevin recommended everybody have some water. This is one that doesn't need it. But if you're going to add a drop of water, it certainly will actually open it up. But this is already cut down to 43%, so it may get a little thin. So I'm going to share my screen so you guys can see my notes here, and make sure I got the right one. How'd I do? Okay, and Command Enter. All right. There we go. Nope. Old Overhault. So Old Overhault is, we don't actually know what the rye mash bill is on this. We know it obviously is at least 51% rye. There's speculation that it's not much more than that. So one of the sort of standard rye recipes in the US is a 51%, which is 51% rye, 39% corn, 10% malted barley. Honestly, they don't publish it. I'm not stating that as a fact. But there's always been a speculation that Old Overhault is on the lower end from a rye, a concentration of rye standpoint. And I think that's actually one of the reasons why it's used in Manhattan so much. It's a very, very clean rye. Rye is known for having a big sort of spicy bite on the back of the palate. You're only gonna find a small amount of that classic black pepper note. Black pepper is the signature of rye, and you'll find it in bourbon all the time. When you taste bourbon, we're going to taste it on the Knob Creek. The Knob Creek's peppery note is actually maybe even more prominent than this. So it's sweet. You get baking spices like cinnamon. You get some vanilla. It's got a little oak. It's got some of those sort of hint of vegetal spices that you do get from the rye. It's a relatively young whiskey. It's probably 3 or 4 years old. It's being a lower cost whiskey, but it has a very nice palate. It has a very nice palate. I like slightly higher proof because it usually has more texture, but you can see this has a little bit of that viscosity, a little bit of that sort of leathery texture. There's definitely some citrus, and again, just that tiny hint of black pepper on the back of the palate. Finishes a little oaky. There's some tannins there, and I get that just kind of a little bit of that oak rind, orange rind taste lingering. I don't know if anybody else is getting that, but those have been my tasting notes, and I honestly, I think Overhault is just it's a great, I don't want to just sell it as just a great mixing whiskey, but it really is a great mixing whiskey. And Sammy Karachi, who's worked for us and is one of our partners here, and is our resident mixologist. He always says, don't mix with something that you wouldn't drink. And I'd be perfectly happy to drink this. And I think that's part of the reason why it really makes for a good, it really does make for a great base for a Manhattan. So that's the Overhault. I'll give you guys a second to just, I don't know if you've already finished it. I've been trying to drink a little slower since COVID started.
But both. It started out
right.
strong and then had to take a little breather there. Got a little dicey.
A
couple months or two of trying to kill a COVID with a whiskey.
Kill a COVID with the whiskey.
Questions
fire away.
Okay. Yeah. Let's see. People are still putting them in, so we're pretty even across the board, but the one that has the most votes is, would you recommend adding ice to bourbon or rye? And yes or no, why not? Or why so?
Okay. I love this question. I get this question all the time, and I usually really tick off some serious whiskey people in the room, because I add ice to whiskey all the time. And it's like, oh, what? No, you're not supposed to do that. And I get it. Like if I went over to Kevin's house and Kevin said, hey, here's a 1979 Tom and Tool from Gordon MacPhail I just bought for $1,600 and I'd love to pour it for you. I'm not going to say, yeah, great, throw some rocks on that while you're at it. Because, you know, I'm trying to taste it for the really to get precise and really to get specific with the tasting notes. That's an incredibly complex whiskey. And, you know, it's just not something that I would do because the whiskey is the experience itself. And when you add ice, you dilute it inconsistently, right? So adding a little water opens it up and it dilutes it to where you want it, where it's really not giving you, it's not triggering your pain receptors, right? Like that alcoholic burn on whiskey is your palate going out. And so when you add water, you cut that. When you add ice, you numb your palate, which obviously will cut the pain, but it also cut your ability to taste. And it actually continues to dilute it. The times I do add ice is when I'm not trying to taste, when I feel like it, when I'm not trying to taste for tasting notes, when I'm trying to just enjoy a drink, and it's a high proof bourbon or whiskey or scotch or whatever, where it's still going to hold on to its texture as it dilutes. And as it gets a little cold, that's when I really love to do it. Look, I like to drink whiskey year round. When it's 85 and I'm out on the deck, I want a colder drink, and I don't want something that I'm just like taking tiny little sips of, right? I want to throw some rocks in there so it's got a little bit more volume and a little more heft, and it chills it down, and I just enjoy it. So that's my feeling on ice.
I think everybody should always just drink what they like, how they like.
Drink what you like, how you like it. Yeah, seriously.
That's the best way for you. Let's see. One other question, if you're okay with it. Oh, this one's getting a lot. Peanut butter whiskey. Is it blasphemy or mind blowing?
Blasphemy. No, I, you know what? Like, I used to be an insane purist. I mean, really, no ice, barely ever any water. I used to be a jerk. That's really what it is. And then I met Sammy, and Sammy was such a cocktail expert. And he was like, let me make you a real cocktail. And I was like, why would you waste a good whiskey by putting other stuff in it? You know, and that's really what my attitude was for like the first 15 years that I drank whiskey. And I've only been of the legal drinking age for 10 years. So for a long time, it was like, this is how I believe whiskey should be consumed. And really, Sammy introduced me to a lot of different spirits and the art of mixology and things like that. And it really opened my mind. I mean, at a peanut butter whiskey, like it's really not for me, because it's just not for me. And also, I think for me drinking whiskey, a lot of the time I really like the context. I like to know where it's from. I like to know how it's made. And then I usually like to think about it in comparison to other whiskeys from the same place. So with single malts, I really like to look at different ages, different independent bottlings. With bourbons, I like to look at other brands, right? Jim Beam also makes Knob Creek. They also make Basil Hayden, Booker's, Baker's. They're all from the Jim Beam distillery. I love drinking a single barrel of one of these guys and then seeing how does it compare to the other whiskeys. When you start adulterating the whiskey and not for the purpose of making a cocktail, you kind of lose that context. And so for me, whiskey's a little bit more than just how it tastes in a vacuum. So
we got some people asking what peanut butter whiskey is. I was wondering if there's a parallel Zoom going on somewhere where people are tasting peanut butter and somebody asks, what do you think about peanut butter whiskey? You know, blasphemy or mind blowing? And they're like, no, you shouldn't add whiskey to peanut butter. That's horrible. The peanut butter purists also don't like it, but somewhere in the middle, somebody's buying this stuff. So I guess there's a market.
Yeah, I guess that's the way it is.
All right.
All right, let's dive right back in. So what's interesting, we've talked about rye, but obviously the dominant whiskey in the United States for the last 260 years has been has been bourbon or bourbon adjacent whiskeys. And to be honest, it's really unclear who first made bourbon. If you really are just crazy about, history and whiskey history, I really recommend Fred Minnick's book, the Bourbon, the Rise, Fall, and Rebirth of something or other. If you just do Rise, Fall, and Rebirth, you'll find it. He really gets into who likely was the first person to start using a mash bill, right? And a mash bill is where we started having the bourbon mash bill, which was roughly a 3-to-1 ratio of corn to rye. And that was really because the regulations with bourbon grew over time, and the practice of making bourbon grew over time. But who really started making it with a mash bill and aging it in charred oak? It was not Elijah Craig. I can tell you that. Elijah Craig is not the father of bourbon. That story is actually total nonsense. But what's pretty I think awesome is the first written publication of somebody recommending that 75-25 ratio was a book called The Distiller by Harrison Hall, who of course was from Boston. And Harrison Hall, he actually also in the book, he basically says there's a technique coming out of Kentucky to mix a mash of 75% corn, 25% rye, and a portion malted barley, and basically describes it as the optimal ratio for making whiskey. He even talks about seasoning oak containers by burning straw inside of them. It would be 100+ years before charred oak containers became sort of the norm. But we can see the beginning of sort of how bourbon was made. And what's very cool is if you look at Canadian whiskey, we'll see it actually developed simultaneously with bourbon. And they came to so many of the same conclusions. In fact, for a long time, they were pretty much interchangeable. As you can imagine, the early years in the north on this continent, the U.S.-Canadian border was a lot looser than it is today. And you'll find that many of the actual really famous whiskey producers in Canada were from the U.S. and eventually down the road, vice versa. And so the sort of one of the biggest examples of this, one of the best examples of this is the largest Canadian distillery and the largest distillery in North America, which is Hiram Walker. Hiram Walker was built in 1858 in Windsor, Ontario. And anyone want to guess where Hiram Walker was born? Massachusetts in 1818. And interestingly, he moved to Detroit in 1838. He built the distillery just across the way in Windsor. He actually took a ferry to work every day from Detroit to Canada, no big deal. And he built this distillery. Now, whether he had a copy of Harrison Hall's The Distiller or not, nobody knows. But given that it was the manual for making whiskey of that era, it would actually be shocking if he didn't. And what's really interesting about that is Canadian whiskey to this day is made with roughly the same ratio, 75-25 corn to rye. But what's annoying about this and confusing about this is when they started adding rye to their whiskey, small portions of rye to their whiskey, the Canadians started identifying those whiskeys as rye. So to this day, Canadian rye is defined as Canadian whiskey with some portion of rye in it. So basically, their bourbon mash bill is what they would call a rye, what we would call a rye. So you get how this gets a little confusing. But essentially, the classic Canadian whiskey uses the exact same ratios that have been incredibly popular in the United States. And before they basically discovered how to use enzymes, how to cultivate and use enzymes to produce whiskey in the early 1900s, American whiskey and Canadian whiskey were just made exactly the same. And what's kind of really this bifurcation point, this point where things really changed, was right at the turn of the century, right at from this period from 1890 to about 1910. The whiskey industries of Canada and the US really went in separate directions. So basically, in the United States, the whiskey makers, the guys who were bottling the whiskey, the blenders and bottlers and like the whiskey makers were separate, right? So today, Jim Beam ferments, distills, ages, and bottles their whiskey. They sell it to a wholesaler. The wholesaler sells it to a retailer. The retailer sells it to you and me, right? But back then, what happened was Jim Beam would make a barrel of bourbon. They would sell it to a wholesaler. The wholesaler would blend it and bottle it under a label that they often owned. And these wholesaler blenders were often called rectifiers, which is now a curse word in the whiskey industry, because the rectifiers were adding all kinds of crap to it. Really disgusting stuff like tobacco spit, prune juice was kind of more mild. Even things like neutral grain spirit that was not properly made, so it was full of methanol and killed people. Like really, really bad. And basically, from 1890 until 1909, the distillers were constantly battling from a legal standpoint with the wholesalers. And for us in the US, we didn't like regulation. We didn't like the idea of trying to sort of put a clamp down on the wholesalers. And they kept winning all of the legal battles and everything in Congress, until Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle, which is just a crazy thing to think about, right? Upton Sinclair writes The Jungle and reveals all of the sort of disgusting practices of the meatpacking industry, and it actually carried over into the whiskey industry. And public opinion changed about how whiskey could be made and what you should put in it. There was the Taft decision of 1909, the Bottle and Bond Act of 1897. There were a lot of things that sort of changed in there, and we won't get into it because it's just a little bit too nitty gritty. But basically, public opinion changed, and bourbon became the most heavily regulated whiskey in the world by a mile. And that was when sort of all of these rules, like can't be distilled over 160 proof, can't be put in barrel at above 125 proof, has to be aged for at least 2 years, has to be a mash bill of at least 51% corn, no additives. If you start getting into all the subcategories, you get a boatload more rules. This would actually end up being a huge boon for the industry. This increased the overall quality of bourbon, just as a category, over years. But what's really interesting is a few decades later, Congress would pass a law that all bourbon had to be aged in new charred oak. It was passed because of the lumber lobby. And this is really when bourbon, these rules plus that law is really when bourbon started to take its modern day shape. Back then it was all blended whiskey. Nothing was aged for more than a year. Like, this is when things really started to change and bourbon started to look like it does now. So speaking of, you guys should all have some Knob Creek. Let's pour ourselves some Knob Creek here. Knob Creek is owned and produced at the Jim Beam Distillery in Kentucky. Knob is a 9-year-old bourbon, which makes this pretty dang good value. It's generally aged in the middle floors. So the Jim Beam warehouses are 9 stories tall. Those are some big warehouses. And if you understand warehousing at all, with bourbon, the floor matters dramatically because the temperature and the humidity change by 40 degrees, whether you're on the top floor or the bottom floor, and by a huge percentage in terms of humidity, which means it totally dictates to how it ages. It's now said that 80% of the flavor of bourbon comes from the barrel. So how the barrel is influencing the whiskey based on where it is in the warehouse has a huge effect on how the whiskey is going to taste. So these are in the mid floors, floor 4 or 5. So it's a sort of a middling climate as far as Kentucky aging goes. So it's a relatively balanced whiskey in terms of it's not quite as sort of syrupy and extractive as its sort of bigger brother, which is Booker's, which is more of a top floor whiskey, and so it's not quite as kind of syrupy and dense, and that's something you'll really see. So, guys, I'm going to share my screen right now so everybody can see where we're at. Go back to. Okay, that didn't work. Okay, it didn't work at all. Hold on one sec. All right, here we go. Got it back. I warned and enter. Ha! All right. I warned Kevin beforehand that I'm a Luddite. I'm just horrible with technology. But here we go. We can actually see what the tasting notes are, and I am going to pour myself a little drop here so I can give you some live notes. This one is 100 proof. So at 100 proof, that's really when I like to start adding. I start with a few drops of water. You know, if you don't have a, like I have one of these sort of fancy water droppers on hand usually. You don't need it. It's just for convenience sake if you're a whiskey-aholic like I am. So I'd start with a few drops and see what happens. I'd probably taste it first. If you're newer to whiskey, take tiny sips and then start adding water and then get to a point where you're comfortable. The silly mistake people make with whiskey is the distillery bottles it at higher proof, expecting you to proof it down to where you want it. That's the point. That's why the whole sort of cask strength movement started. So add water until you're comfortable. It's just what I'm saying, particularly if you're newer to whiskey. So when we nose this, immediately you get sort of classic bourbon notes, right? Caramel, brown sugar, that butterscotch note. The spearmint, that's a rye influence. And that sort of red cherry. You get cherry in a lot of good bourbons. And then of course oak tannin. One of my partners here who's actually in the chat, Phil Meehan, he always tastes Knob Creek and says it tastes green. And that kind of synesthesia, I know exactly what he's talking about. There are times when I taste whiskey and I can't describe the flavor, and I just start describing a color, and I'll be like, oh, this tastes darker. And people are like, what do you mean? The darker color? I don't know how to tell you what that means all the time. But when he says it tastes green, I know exactly what he means. It's got that kind of fresh wood flavor, like when you snap a limb off of a branch and you expect a branch off of a tree or a limb and you expect it to be kind of dead, and then you're like, oh wow, there's that greenness. And if you ever smell it or taste it, I was very tactile, and I liked putting things in my mouth when I was a little kid. So I have a lot of experience chewing on wood. But you get that kind of very fresh wood flavor. And then on the palate, classic big tannic oak profile, right? I mean, really, you notice the oakiness immediately. That's 9 years. But again, it's not that overly mouth smacking stickiness, right? It's more of you can taste it more than feel it. And it's got that caramel, vanilla. I think this has quite a bit of sort of peppercorn rye spice on the back palate. So rye spice, you will experience like the upper back roof of your palate. It creates a little bit of an astringency, a little bit of a pepperiness, almost like a cayenne jalapeno. That's what I get when I start tasting this. And it's the finish is just classic black pepper, right? Like fresh black pepper. And that again, that you're getting from the rye. Really interestingly, the mash bill on Knob Creek is, I believe, 77% corn, 13% rye, 10% malted barley. So this is by no means a high rye whiskey. But that's about what we're getting at, and it really, you still notice it, particularly at a higher proof, because you're just getting a little bit more from a texture standpoint. So this is a good time to pause for questions. Kevin, do we have anything?
Yeah, let me pepper you with a few.
Pepper me with one or two, because I want to make sure we get through everything.
Yep, absolutely. This is a little specific to Boston, but maybe we can broaden it. They asked, what would you say is the best whiskey collection at a bar in the Boston area? And if you have expertise elsewhere in the country, would you recommend any bars for whiskey?
I would say from a whiskey standpoint, unfortunately, a ton of the really the best bars are closing, which is a super unpleasant aspect of COVID. But I would say the smoke shop is fantastic in Boston. There are a couple of them. Some of you picked up your samples there at the one at Assembly Square. There's another one in Cambridge. Andy Husbands is a genius from a barbecue kind of guy, and he really just mixes his barbecue with whiskey. And so they have a great selection. So that's a great place. But we don't have the best whiskey bar scene. The two best whiskey bars in the country are in Washington, D.C. and Seattle. It's Jack Rose, number one by a mile. Jack Rose is the best bar in the world for whiskey. And then Cannon in Seattle is arguably number two. I'm saying that, but I know one or two whiskey fanatics who would just slap me in the face right now, because there are 3 or 4 bars in Japan that are the best bourbon bars on the planet. And that's arguable. Japan has one of the best bourbon scenes in the world, for sort of interesting, obvious reasons. And then for Scotland, if you ever get a chance to go to the library in the Craigellachie Hotel, it's by invite only. They have a bar in the Craigellachie Hotel downstairs. It's great. I was lucky enough to get invited by the owner of Walker Shortbread Cookies. Took me out to dinner when I was in Scotland, and he was like, "I want to take you to the best bar," and we went to the bar, and it was cool. It was really cool. I was like, "This bar's great, but I don't know what the big deal is." And then the owner came down and was like, "Mr. Walker, would you like to go up to the library?" And I was like, "Oh, okay. Now we're going to go drink in the library. That sounds cool." I didn't realize the library was a whiskey library, and they had those huge like ladders, and it was one of those high roofed, and it's just all leather chairs. And it was, I don't know, 10,000 scotches. It was the craziest. It was one of the craziest whiskey drinking experiences of my life. We chatted for 15 minutes, and then the owner said, "Nick, would you like to just do a flight on the house? Anything you want in a bar with 10,000 scotches." It was just like, and so I was at the Craigellachie Hotel, so I did a flight of all of the Craigellachie's, which was very cool. Somebody just threw into the chat here, Haven and JP. Haven and JP is really fun. It's a really fun whiskey bar. They have a diversity of scotch that I really appreciate. The last hurrah was really great for a long time, but their guy retired, and I don't know if it's still open. So that's a smattering of my bar knowledge. What else we got, Kevin?
The only other one here is, should whiskey be chilled? And if so, when? I think you already touched on this a bit with ice. Maybe they're talking more about
if you're going to mix it.
Being chilled.
You're going to make a highball, put the whiskey in the freezer.
Very good.
Cool.
Let's hold it at that and move on.
Awesome. All right. So at the same time that American whiskey was being highly, highly regulated, this is when Canadian whiskey went in a different direction. And I will pause and say, the first whiskey making country, big whiskey making country to implement an age minimum requirement was Canada. And in fact, the Scottish regulations on on how to age and make whiskey are actually based off of the Canadian laws that went in place 10 years in advance of the Canadian law. I mean, of the Scotch laws. That being said, it basically focused on 3-year age minimum, and it really didn't get that much more specific. But while American whiskey was really starting to get, was really dictating to creating a really narrow profile and basically saying this is how the whiskey is made and should taste. Canadian whiskey went completely in a different direction. And for them, they saw the value in making whiskey being really rooted in blending. And they didn't have the rectifier problem. And a bunch of scientific, a bunch of things that were scientific advancements that were happening in science around enzymes and cultivating enzymes, and basically, you basically didn't have to use malted barley anymore to produce alcohol. So malted barley has a naturally occurring enzyme in it, where if you start to soak barley, it has an enzyme that will convert starch into sugar really, really efficiently. And that's why, to this day, every bourbon and rye mash bill in the United States has at least 5% malted barley in it. Because if you don't have that enzyme and you don't convert a lot of starch to sugar, you don't produce a lot of alcohol in your beer, and then you get a really, really low yield. You make crappy whiskey and it's super expensive. And so what the Canadians figured out was, it was just like, screw that. Why don't we add enzymes, and then we can start making 100% corn whiskey, 100% rye whiskey, 100% barley whiskey, 100% wheat whiskey. We can age them separately and blend it together at the end. And what that allowed them to do, what was really important about that, and I know if this wasn't the MIT group, I wouldn't get into this, but from a fermentation standpoint, different grains have optimal pHs and temperatures for producing certain acids and alcohols. So basically, if you want to create certain esters, you need to do it at certain temperatures and certain pHs. And when you are processing all the grains simultaneously, which is a mash bill, you're compromising big time. And when you start having the enzymes such that you can control that, you can actually start creating very, very specific, very intentional flavors. And that was really when Canadian whiskey started to take off, because they didn't have to do a mash bill anymore, and it really opened them up to make a ton of different type of whiskey. They also were not wedded to, we only make whiskey in a pot still, or we only do it in a column still, and then and then double it in a pot. They said, oh, okay, we'll do double distilled to a really high proof. We'll do pot distilled to a low proof. We'll take cuts here. We'll do single column distill. We'll do whatever we have to do to create a really broad palette of whiskeys that will be in the best position to blend. Nonetheless, Canadian and American whiskey still stayed relatively the same. Like, we think of bourbon as being this really traditional historical product in the US, but Four Roses was the #1 premium brand in 1952. They were selling 1.5 million 9-liter cases a year. It was a blend. It was a blended whiskey. It was not the straight Four Roses bourbon we make today. It was a blend, and that was still the style. So what was really interesting is, contrary to sort of popular opinion to this day, we kind of there's this notion in the US that Canadian whiskey became a thing in 1920 when Prohibition started. And actually, Prohibition just killed Canadian whiskey. It destroyed Canadian whiskey to the point where this one guy, Bronfman, was able to basically go and buy up all of the Canadian distilleries. He started buying all the big Canadian distilleries, and he merged with Seagram and Sons. And what he was incredibly good at doing was basically slithering around and manipulating the prohibition laws in the US and the prohibition laws in Canada. He would do things like take everything by sea. And so he would kind of like, he was using international waters to get around rules. He had mafia connections. He knew what he was doing. And when Prohibition ended, Seagram's exploded. Seagram's just absolutely became huge. They became the most successful whiskey conglomerate in the world. They owned 10 huge distilleries in the United States and 4 huge distilleries in Canada. They owned Glenlivet. They owned the Dewar's brand. They owned the Four Roses brand. They owned, like, I think at one point it was 7 of the top 10 brands in the world. I mean, just like absolutely crazy. And Seagram's absolutely dominated the industry to the point where in the 1950s, the American competitors said, if we need to do something about Seagram's, we need to box Seagram's out from making bourbon in Canada. That's what we're going to do. And so we set out to make bourbon the official product of the United States. And we were successful. By 1964, bourbon is the official drink of the U.S., in case you're wondering. And by 1964, Canada had created a law in Canada that had passed the law in Canada that bourbon was the exclusive product of the United States, and they couldn't make bourbon in Canada. And really interestingly, like, Seagram's ended up collapsing 10 years later, having absolutely nothing to do with that. The 3rd generation Bronfman tried to get into the movie business, and he made a bunch of really terrible business decisions, and Seagram started to collapse. But what was interesting is the narrative from 1964 on was, okay, we have this thing that only we can make. The Canadians can't make it. Seagram's can't make it. We need to propagate the idea that straight bourbon is elite. It's the best stuff, and blended whiskey is the crap. And that was the messaging that has been propagated in the US for 50 years, really until like 2010. And we'll say why 2010 was a big year in a second here. There's honestly those 50 years, we could do an entire tasting. We could do an entire night on the 50 years from 1964 to 2014. But we don't have that kind of time. But I'll tell you one thing that's really crazy. Canadian whiskey became the top selling whiskey in the United States in 1865. It would not relinquish that title until 2010. It has been the top selling whiskey in the United States for 145 years. And it was finally surpassed by bourbon in 2010. It's still neck and neck to this day. And that doesn't include all the stuff that they make in Canada that's bottled down here and called American whiskey. The Canadians have dominated North American whiskey industry from a sales standpoint. Hiram Walker, which is the biggest distillery in Canada, has 1.3 million barrels aging in it. Heaven Hill, which is the biggest in the US, has 500,000 barrels aging in it. Like, Canadian whiskey industry is doing fine. But lest you think the Canadian influence on American whiskey has waned, give me a little hand wave if you've heard of MGP. Anybody? The MGP, they own a little distillery called the LDI. Sorry for the acronyms. LDI is Lawrenceburg Distillers, Indiana. LDI has contract distilled over the last 10 years for the following whiskey brands. And I'm actually going to share my screen for a second. If I can do this without, accidentally shutting down the whole tasting here. Okay, and enter. All right. Anybody heard of any of these? Angel's Envy, Barrel Whiskey, Bull Run, Bullet, Chattanooga, Cleveland Rye, Defiance, Doubleday, George Dickel Rye, High West, James E. Pepper, J.R. Reveille, Joseph Magnus, Metz, Pinhook, Pritchard's, Rebel Yell, Redemption, Sagamore, Smooth Ambler, Smuggler's Notch, Templeton, Tin Cup, Whistle Pig, Old World, Widow Jane, Willet. This is to name a few, just a few. They have been the contract distiller, the supplier for 80% of the craft bourbon brands that have started over the last 10, 11 years. And they contract distill, which basically means they are you tell them what you want and they make it for you. So why is there this giant big ass distillery in Indiana that no one's heard of that makes all of our whiskey, almost as if it was designed for blending? MGP bought the Lawrenceburg Distillery, Indiana, from Seagram's. It's an old Seagram's plant. So Seagram's still is like all in our hair here. So let's circle all the way back to Whistlepig, and then let's try some whiskey. But at the beginning, I told you Whistlepig has had a dramatic impact on the perception of the link between Canadian and American whiskey, right? Why? Well, Whistlepig came out in 2010, and they had a 10-year rye from Vermont that no one had ever heard of, and was amazing. It won a ton of awards. Everybody started writing about it, and it started over the next couple of years. It got on everybody's radar. But people started wondering, wait a second, this is an aged rye from a distillery that was founded in 2007 and started operating in 2010, and it's a 10-year-old product. And that was a little confusing, obviously. We can do simple math, but it didn't take people long to figure out where it was coming from. And the giveaway was they wrote on the label 100% rye. So 100% rye, to make 100% rye, to make a rye whiskey without malted barley, you have to add enzymes. And adding enzymes in the United States is illegal. So a bunch of writers said this actually must be from Canada. This whiskey is being sourced from Canada. To the point where Whistlepig, there was some legal action taken against Whistlepig, and Whistlepig had to reveal and actually put on the back of their label, product of Canada. And now everybody was kind of in a pickle because all of these writers had written about Whistlepig. They had said, "Oh, this great American whiskey, etc. It's everything we ever dreamed of." All of these awards. All these drinkers were saying, "This is my favorite American whiskey," and then everybody finds out it's from Canada, right? And you're sitting there going, "Wait a second, we have to reconsider everything we think about Canada." This notion that Canadian was always blended whiskey was inherently bad. We really had to reconsider it, and it then got revealed that Whistlepig was being sourced primarily from a distillery, ADL. I apologize for all the acronyms, but Alberta Distillers Limited. And ADL had been producing all of this wonderful rye whiskey in Canada for Whistlepig. And anybody want to guess who to this day owns ADL? Jim Beam. And so you see, like, the industries, they went like this a little bit, but really they've been like this forever, just not in our minds. And now what's been fascinating for us is, so like what people have realized over the last sort of 5 or 6 years is anything with a substantial age statement that's a rye that isn't from Buffalo Trace, if it's not like Thomas Handy or the Sazerac 18, it's probably from Canada. Lock, Stock, and Barrel, Jefferson's Rye, Hochstadter's 16, 18, 20-year-old, Basil Hayden's Dark Rye, Basil Hayden's Caribbean Rye, Little Book Batch 2. Those are all Canadian ryes, all. And of course, Whistlepig. And so what does that mean for us over at Found North? For us, we started to realize that at the end of 2019, that the Canadians make phenomenal whiskey. And moreover, that whiskey drinkers don't really care that Whistlepig was making whiskey from Canada. What they really cared about was the deception. And so for us, we said, all right, let's go get rye from Canada. Let's go get really good rye from Canada. But instead of telling people that it's, grandma's recipe or, rye that we grew in our backyard or some nonsense, let's just tell people where it's from. And this really led my brother and my co-founder, Zach, to approach distilleries. It started in he found a bunch of distilleries and distillers and master blenders from Canada at Whiskey Live in Paris. And honestly, he started negotiating with them. And this was the hardest part of the process. Sourcing whiskey sounds really easy. You go in, you say, hey, this is what I want, and then they give it to you. That's really not how it works. If you have hundreds of thousands of barrels aging in your warehouse, one, you can't just walk in there and start tasting things. You'll die before you get through a fraction of a percent of the whiskey. And on top of it, they don't want to sell you your best stuff, right? They don't want to sell you the best stuff. And if you're small like us, selling us 100 barrels might be all the money we have in the world, which it was. But for them, it's not even a drop in the bucket. It's not even on their radar. And so, to be honest, my brother was absolutely brilliant at negotiating with them, pushing them to give us older and older whiskey. Obviously, our whiskeys are both 16 years old. Our partner distillery, which I signed an NDA, I can't disclose, but our partner distillery originally said the oldest stuff they had was 11 years. It was obviously older than that. But this back and forth process was crazy. It took us months of getting lots, and then it took us 9 months to blend. So all I did during COVID was drink. Really, that's all I did. Holy cow. But one of the really funny things that happened was when we started, and I promise we'll get to drinking these in a second, but when we started blending, the idea was, let's make it 100% rye. This is really popular. 100% rye is this thing that everybody likes. And I kept tasting it and saying to one of the master blenders, I said, man, this flavor's amazing, but holy cow, there's this crazy peppery bite in the back of my palate. Like, oh my goodness, it's so strong. Do you have anything that tastes like this, but just with less astringency, less bite? And finally, after like 5 meetings with this guy where I kept pushing him for this stuff, he finally said to me as politely as possible, Nick, I mean this in the nicest way I can, but in the United States, you guys haven't made rye in any real volume since World War II, and you have no idea what it tastes like. and he said, rye is spicy. It's really, really spicy. There's a reason that we double distill corn and use it in our blends. And he convinced me to try some corn whiskeys. He said, just start adding these to your blends. They're going to round it out. It's going to make it taste really, really interesting. And what was particularly interesting was he also said, you guys make ryes that are 51% rye, 40% corn. And he said, if you distill the equal amounts corn and equal amounts rye separately or together, you will get a 7-to-4 ratio of corn to rye in terms of how much alcohol you get, because there's such a higher starch content in corn. So essentially, our 51%, 40%, 51%, 39% ratio is really still a corn-based whiskey. It's legally a rye in the U.S., but in terms of where the quantities are coming from, it's really coming from the corn. So let's look at batch one. Now, batch one is Found North. Batch one is it's 57.1% alcohol by volume. We bottled it at cask strength. Also, we blended this to be a monster, to be big, to be really, really robust, rugged flavored. So get your water out, give it a taste. And some of you who are veterans and drink a lot of the sort of higher whiskey veterans who drink a lot of the higher proof stuff, you won't have any problem with this. People who are newer to whiskey, give it a little taste, but it's going to kick you in the back of the palate. It's going to be spicy. It's going to have a big influence on the back of the palate. Liberal amounts of water are perfectly appropriate for this. We anticipated that it would be spicy to people, and we anticipated that people would add water to it. So I'm going to share my screen so you guys can get a look at the bottle, and also then get a look at the whiskey.
And Nick, just to clarify for folks, I believe after you go through this one, you'll be talking about the Whistle Pig. Is that right?
I will. I'm going to show it. I'm going to give my notes for Whistle Pig as well here, just so everybody can get. All right. So this is Found North. Yes, Kevin. I should have just said yes. That was the appropriate answer. All right. So this is Found North batch one. You can see the bottle. We enjoyed that. That's all Sammy and Zach. I had nothing to do with the bottle. You can't even see the only influence I had on the bottle, which is putting a wax top on it. Zach and Sammy, I just think did a brilliant design job. Photograph done by Phil, who's in the house right now. Thanks, Phil. But 66% rye, 30% corn, 4% malted barley. Cask strength 57.1%. Now, this is not a mash bill. This is 66% rye from Canadian rye, which means they did not. That means it's separate, right? So it's after distillation, right? So it's the liquid, not what the original grain was, which is a really hard distinction to process. But we aged it in Hungarian oak. So basically, Canadians don't have to do everything in new oak. That law is not present in Canada, which is awesome because it means we can really play around with different cask types. And in particular, we don't have to use new oak and just bombard our whiskey with oak. We also aged some of it in ex-Speyside Scotch casks. And then the coolest thing was the corn component, which was a 20-year-old corn. It was aged for 13 years in refill barrels, used oak, and then spent the final 7 years in new oak. Had an incredible, we called it sample 18 because it was the 18th corn sample we got. Sample 18 was the foundation stone of this whiskey in a lot of ways. All the texture. So 1300 bottle batch. And let's taste this thing. And here are my tasting notes, and I will taste it with you. And then I'm gonna put up tasting notes in a minute for the Whistle Pig for those of you who are out of state or didn't get a chance to get samples and are using Whistle Pig instead. So you'll notice it's a big spice palette, peppermint, chives, even creamy Irish butter. It's really got some creaminess to it, which was very intentional from a blending standpoint. Vanilla bean. I thought it had a lot of really cool sort of berry fruit notes, raspberry, obviously. The palate, big spice kick. This is spice. This is what rye used to taste like. And I think it's a really kind of an authentic expression of rye. That jalapeno cayenne, you'll get it right on the roof of your mouth. You should notice it immediately. But what's interesting is when you take the second sip and you keep tasting this, you'll notice that there are kind of some more fruit notes that you can't actually really produce from U.S. rye. The reason is that when you put things in new oak, it's incredibly extractive, and so the dominant flavor becomes the oak. If you are able to put it in used oak, you can really get esterification. The whiskey will oxidize. Basically, one of the main reasons we char the inside of the barrel is because it will help break O2 molecules into free radical O atoms, which are obviously highly reactive. And that's where a ton of the esterification comes from, particularly the top notes, the fruit notes, which just take time. In American whiskeys, they get overrun by the wood because if you age it in new oak for 15, 20 years, the amount of time that it would take to get that esterification, it's like chewing on a pencil, right? It just kind of, you get wood shavings in it and it boxes out all of those flavors. Really, really long finish. Blackberry, brown sugar, black pepper. Seriously, please add a liberal amount of water to this. It opens up, it gets easier to drink, and it really gets more florality and fruitiness. Really, really fun news that some of you have already seen. We announced it today. The results of the San Francisco World Spirits Competition. It's kind of the biggest spirits competition in the world. We submitted our whiskeys before we even released them to SFWSC, and Found North Batch 1 received a double gold, which means tasting blind. The judges all gave it the highest mark. We thought we made a good whiskey, but that happening was absolutely bananas. I can't begin to tell you how excited we are. For those of you who are drinking Whistle Pig, these are my Whistle Pig tasting notes: vanilla, caramel, peppermint, very herbaceous. From a nose standpoint, they do get they tend to get some mocha notes as well, which I think is really cool. The palate's oakier, more baking spices, kind of nutmeg. You get the same sort of caramel that's on there. And I think the finish has this just very cool, very Whistle Pig, very Canadian rye, sour cherry note. Really, really nice. Rye spice, obviously. You'll get some of the same black pepper, and oaky. It's got nice oak tannins. The Whistle Pig likes to take the ADL barrels that they get and recast them into new oak. And so they'll recast it into new oak. And that really new oak is just kind of like sandpaper. It just rounds every rough edge. Now the result is you get an oakier whiskey, but you can do it for a few years and really just round out any edges that you don't want. That would be, I think, one of the fundamental differences between our whiskey and Whistle Pig. Is ours has, I think, a little bit more sharp edges, and is a little bit more dynamic because we don't mute the flavors as much with new oak. And that's not to say I think ours is better. Of course I do. I blended it. But I think they make a phenomenal whiskey, and it's just a testament to how good the stuff they're making in Canada is. So guys, we're getting right to the end here, and I want you to get right into the fourth and final whiskey. So the last whiskey we're going to taste is Found North Batch 2. So this is a fun story. So we had sample 18. We had this 20-year-old corn whiskey, and we were blown away by it. They distilled it to a higher proof. They put it in at a higher entry proof, and they really do. They stick it in there for 13 years, and the effect is there are less congeners. There are less really sort of reactive heavy compounds in there because they've distilled it up into like the 180s. And then they bring it down into the 150s to be casked. But when you have that high ethanol content, you have a much more stable whiskey in the wood. And so for 13 years, you're just basically retaining that really oily right off the still texture and developing these nice top notes from a fruit standpoint, from an esterification and an oxidation standpoint. And that becomes the foundation of the whiskey. Then they transfer it into that new oak for 7 years, and you get all of the lactones, which produce the vanillins, all the tannins that give you that oak spice profile. And so we wanted this to be the foundation of our second whiskey, which we had intended to be a rye. We had these 17-year-old ex-wheated bourbon barrel aged ryes. So basically, take a wheated bourbon. I'm going to bet my bottom dollar it's Maker's Mark, but I don't know. They didn't tell us. They don't disclose. But when you think wheated bourbon, I mean, what could it be? It could be Weller. I don't know if our partner distillery has a relationship with Buffalo Trace. It could be Maker's Mark. Maker's Mark sells a lot of barrels to a lot of different places in a lot of different countries because they can't use them a second time. So it was a barrel that had aged a wheated bourbon and then aged our rye, our 17-year-old rye. And it produced this crazy kind of creamy, pepperminty, just really delicious rye, just unbelievably good rye. And we blended it with the corn, and we started experimenting with this sample 18 to see what would happen. And we got to a really crazy inflection point because we were originally, when we did this branding, it was like, it's all about rye because rye is so dang popular right now. We want to release rye number 1, rye number 2. And what happened was we started blending and we started tweaking the ratios. And the more we got closer and closer to 50-50 corn to rye, the better it got. And then we tried it at 50-50 corn to rye. And we said, dang, this is the best we've done. We've got to try this by increasing the ratio of the corn just to see what happens. And so we did, and it was just an awesome whiskey, but it no longer legally qualified as a rye. And so we were like, are we a rye company or are we a bottle the best whiskey we can make company? And we went with the latter. So we settled on an 80% corn, 19% rye, 1% malted barley grain ratio. And as a result, it's cask strength 64.9% alcohol by volume. So just under 130 proof. So again, liberal amounts of water. And then we blended in a tiny bit of a Hungarian oak aged barrel, just to add some sort of earthier tones to it. So let's go ahead and pour that. I mean, I'm sure you have. And this was the biggest surprise for us. We loved this whiskey, but we had no idea if anybody else would like it. Honestly, we just didn't know if people would respond to a Canadian whiskey that's not rye, right? Because like we have no comp sets. There is literally nobody that we compare to. This whiskey nobody's making this. Nobody is making this. They don't make this in Canada very much. They just don't have a market for the higher proof stuff. And they don't sell it in the U.S. because people have a lot of misconceptions about Canadian whiskey, and they don't have the energy to change people's minds. They're doing too well selling us everything. So they really don't have any need to. So I'm going to pour myself a little bit of this as well, and give you kind of my live feed on this. So you'll notice, I mean, the bourbon drinkers, the cask strength bourbon drinkers, the barrel proof bourbon drinkers are going to go, oh, I recognize you. And then they're going to nose it again and go, wait a second, there's stuff that you just don't get in 20-year-old bourbons. This is obviously 16-year-old age statement, but 80% of the whiskey is 20 years old. And you get these baking spices. You still get some grain, which you never would find. That's that kind of hay barnyard note. The sugar is syrupy, right? It's like Demerara sugar. Obviously, you get that kind of sweet corn, but it's stickier, right? It's like, that's what I'm talking about with that maple syrup. My favorite note on this is courtesy of Phil. Phil was the first person who smelled it on our team, but he said it smells like an orange creamsicle. And I always just thought that was an awesome note. From a palate standpoint, still the rye spice is prominent, right? I mean, you get it right throughout from the tip of your palate where it's like sweet, sugary baking spice, like cinnamon sugar toast. And then as it moves away from all our sweet receptors are on the front of our palate, as that moves away and we stop getting signals of sweetness, it really does a cool transition in the mid palate where you're getting all of the where all your nociceptors are, where all your sort of texture, tactile feeling is. You get the mouth coating, tingling, snap, crackle, pop, but it's so damn viscous that it's oily and syrupy, and it's like, did I just do something crazy? Like just get some Canadian maple syrup and drink a little bit of it. You get kind of that taffy, peppermint in the back of the palate. That's where that rye spice, and the roof of the palate where you get that rye spice mixed with the big wood spice from 7 Years in New Oak. And then that kind of mouth, that earthy forest floor, pine needle, dried leaves kind of flavor. And the finish is really where I think you start to notice the fruit that's on the nose. So I get red apple. I always get rock candy. My favorite whiskeys always taste like rock candy to me, which really interestingly, I only ever had as like a 5-year-old going to the science museum. And then that long lingering cinnamon sugar toast with the oak tannins. So we submitted this also to the San Francisco World Spirits Competition. and it also won double gold. So I've never heard of that. We entered our first 2 whiskeys we ever made into the SF World Spirits competition, and we got the highest marks on both of them, which was really wild. But this has sold incredibly well, which was really shocking. Kent just said what category was batch 2. I know Kevin's just scolding me right now because I'm not supposed to read the questions out of the chat. But it was the Canadian whiskey category. We entered it into the Canadian whiskey category, and it received a double gold, which was awesome. So, but it drinks. I mean, we've sold it pretty much exclusively to really serious bourbon drinkers, and just one of the crazy things for us was we really didn't know how well it would be received. We only released it in Massachusetts initially. We thought it would take a couple months to sell through our first pallet. We sold through our first pallet in 8 days. It has been it's been doing really well. And one of the really fun things for us has been the whiskey community has really embraced us as like Boston whiskey makers. Like as if we're local whiskey makers, which is just a really funny thing because like obviously it was distilled up in Canada. I mean, I blended it in my basement, but that's all that happened in Boston. But I'll take it. We can be Boston whiskey makers. Heck yes. Yeah. So guys, that's really the end here for me. From a presentation standpoint, I did want to share my screen for one more second. Just bear with me for 1 second here, Kevin, before I hand it back to you and we take a bio break. Here we. Oh my goodness. Ha. Okay, got it. Did I get this right? Okay, here we go. Yeah, guys, I know Kevin's going to send this out, but for us, if you really like us, Instagram, and if you want to figure out if you want to subscribe to our mailing list, go to foundnorthwhisky.com. And if you want to buy it, foundnorthwhisky.com and go hit the buy button or that hyperlink /buy now. You'll find the store locator in Massachusetts. If you are not in Massachusetts, I know there are a bunch of people who are not in Massachusetts. I hope some of you are dying to try this or get your hands on a bottle. We are holding, I don't know how many bottles, but we are going to hold some in reserve. We're going to do a sort of direct to consumer so that we can ship it to other states. So just bear with us. If you click on that buy now link or you go to the buy now on Found North, you'll see in the bottom a subscribe, an out of state subscribe, where you can put in your zip code, and we will notify the people who are specifically on that one of our mailing lists, the out of state mailing list. We will notify those people the moment it's available direct to consumer. We know we have some fans who've moved away or just don't live in Boston, and we do really badly want to get you guys bottles. It's going to be a little bit, not too long, but sometime in the next couple months, we will sort of reserve bottles for those people. All right. Done. Kevin, take over.
All right. Well, I think, those are fantastic. Yeah, I'm enjoying just savoring number 2 right now. But I think, we have a lot of tech people on the Zoom, but a lot of us are also interested in the business side. I saw some questions being asked, and I'm personally very curious just about the business of starting a whiskey brand. You started Taylor and Taylor, you did an Armagnac, now you're doing a whiskey. Can you talk at all about just the process of starting a whiskey brand?
Yes.
Pitfalls, what makes whiskey different than other industries that folks might be starting ventures in? Just anything kind of top of mind for you to share with the group.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Dang. Yeah. I wish I honestly, I wish I had Zach here. Zach, hates it when I think of him as like the business guy, because his knowledge of spirits and his knowledge of whiskey is freaking ridiculous. But he also happens to be the most sort of experienced business professional in our on our team. And he really was the mastermind behind the whole trajectory for our company. And basically it's complicated because you can obviously, if you have a vision for this is what I want to build a rye distillery in Framingham, right? I don't know, right? If that was what you wanted to do, you could go to investors and say, okay, we're going to build this rye distillery in Framingham. And they'd say, okay, great. What's the concept? Here's X dollars to build a distillery. But first, what you would do is you would build a brand. So you develop a brand, and you would source whiskey, almost certainly from MGP. They're the guys that you would go to, and you would say, all right, this is the recipe, this is the flavor profile we're going for, this is the recipe we're going for. And the reason is that if you built a distillery, if you did it in record time and you built it in a year, and it still you literally, there's something called like breaking in the stills. For the first several months, you have to just run the stills and get all of the crazy metal flavors out of the whiskey. Like, there's so much time before you could even start putting things in barrel. Then you'd have to wait. No investor is going to say, oh yeah, take 6 years before you're returning any revenue whatsoever, right? That's completely unreasonable. And so what most brands do is they develop the brand by sourcing whiskey, developing the label, and then once their distillery is old enough, then they put the liquid into, then they just switch. Then they switch the liquid, right? And they start putting their own liquid into the bottle instead of somebody else's. That's how a ton of distilleries got started. Tons and tons of distilleries have gotten started that way. It's a very successful model. What we felt like our strategy was different, which was we're very customer focused, and basically for us, my passion is presenting. I like talking about whiskey, and enough people tolerate listening to me that we've developed a bit of a following. And Zach was sort of able to parlay some of my experience in retail, and we bought a cask really early on and were able to sell it. And Zach was able to convince a giant Scotch company to hire us as local brand ambassadors for the New England and eventually the New York area. And they paid us enough to sort of build up a war chest where we would have enough money to approach one of these distilleries without any investment behind us, and actually buy enough barrels to be of interest to people. We went from being brand ambassadors to, okay, we can afford to be importers, which gave us a little bit more. It gave us a little bit more of the brand equity, right? It gave us a little bit more of the upside because we had a deal to be the importers of Domaine de Chiron, which is our Armagnac, which I think a lot of you have tasted. I think it's just amazing, which again, Zach found. Yeah, what does Nick even do in this company, right? Yeah, what you say you do here? I talk to the customers. Sorry, okay, no, office space. But anyway, basically, we were kind of moving up, and then when COVID hit, it torpedoed our whole business model. The whole idea of doing tastings and selling other people's products went by the wayside. We lost all our contracts. So we decided to take a shot and try to develop a brand. We developed a brand in about 9 months, which I can't tell you how record speed that is. The number of logistical pieces that had to be in place from a permitting contract standpoint, TTB, label, from scratch to done from a label standpoint took about 9 months, which was insane. And then it was bottled and ready to go in just about a year, which for us was just unbelievably awesome. And what we did was, the whole time our idea was, look, we know, you would think these big distilleries, they make their own whiskey, right? They would know exactly how to blend and bottle it to optimize it for customers, but they actually don't. They don't spend an enormous amount of time with customers. Master blenders who are at, whatever, let's pretend it's Scotch, a master blender at whatever brand or distillery or whatever, they spend a ton of time with their own product. But, my background was buying and selling whiskey to the most serious whiskey consumers in Boston. And so we really had a familiarity with exactly what flavor profile was popular, and what people liked. And so for us, it was, all right, let's do batches, right? Let's do limited production stuff where it's constantly different. The old style of drinking whiskey was, I'm a Maker's guy, right? I drink Maker's on the rocks, or I'm a Crown and Coke guy, and that's my drink, and it was just one drink. That's what I like. I come back to it. And that was how whiskey was sold forever. And then 20 years ago, whiskey became a hobby that was like collecting baseball cards. Nobody goes and tries to get 100 of the same baseball card. They want 100 different cards, right? You want this guy's rookie card and this guy's rookie card and this guy's. And so for us, we took the same approach with our whiskey, which was, we said, we're going to be the blenders. We're going to affect the flavor. That's how we're going to add value. We're not going to try to distill and build a distillery and take and then try to create one product for the rest of our lives. That just sounds too much like marriage. And so we ended up, so basically what we said was, we're going to blend batches. We're going to blend batches that are in limited production, so that the people who are the most excited about whiskey are constantly constantly going and are excited for the next thing we make, right? They'll buy it. And by the way, like anybody who likes Found North, we're almost out. You need to go buy a bunch of bottles. If you want to keep drinking this stuff, it's going to be gone, right? And so we like that idea. We like that sense of urgency, and we like having a much more intimate relationship with our customers. There's this narrative in the whiskey industry that the distillers make the stuff, the writers write about it, and then the whiskey consumers drink it. It's like it's a one-way street, and that is crap. The way that the real way the whiskey industry works is customers tell the whiskey industry what they like, because the whiskey industry, they make the whiskey, and then customers either buy it and like it or they don't. And if they don't, then the whiskey industry doesn't make that anymore. And so rather than carrying on this facade of like, we're these geniuses who know exactly what everybody's going to like, we like to have a really intimate relationship with our customers, and get a strong contingency of followers who say, no, we like these guys. These are our guys. These are our local guys. These are the guys that we've known for years, and we're into what they make because they know what we like. And that's been really our business model in a nutshell.
Awesome. That was 9 minutes. You did it.
I did it.
Yeah.
It was a big question.
Well, it's funny because that was a great answer. I remember grabbing pizza with you after an event when you were still working retail, and like, you're like, yeah, I'm moving on to something new. We're starting our own business, and it was super exciting back then, and it still is now. So I'm glad to see all the success, and wish you and Zach continued success and the best of luck as you go on. And I hope we can have you back here for some more whenever you release whatever the next thing is that you come up with.
I'm going to be blending for the next month, and we're going to come up with a couple more batches. Yeah, that's all I'm going to be doing for a while. It's going to be fun.